Imagine finalizing a multi-million-dollar medical device submission. You've spent years in R&D.
And millions on clinical trials.
Exactly, millions. And your regulatory team is, totally ready to hit submit. Then the FDA just slams the brakes on your entire clearance timeline, demanding a brand new multi-month human factors validation study.
Which is a nightmare scenario for any project manager.
Oh, absolutely. But here is the kicker. A trigger for that massive delay. Your marketing team decided to, tweak the font size and lay out on a user warning label just to accommodate a new corporate logo.
Yeah, a simple graphic design choice.
Right. Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are looking at the new 2026 FDA framework that makes a scenario exactly like that not just possible, but, well, highly probable.
A whole new ballgame now.
It really is. We are undertaking a highly focused technical exploration tailored specifically for those of you operating right at the intersection of medical device innovation and regulatory compliance. So the expert-level quality regulatory R&D and medical safety professionals are listening right now.
Because the landscape of product development is constantly shifting beneath our feet, right? But occasionally, a regulatory event occurs that fundamentally redraws the map.
And this is one of those times.
Definitely. We're looking at a paradigm shift that requires a complete recalibration of how cross-functional teams approach device usability and risk management.
Yeah.
From, the earliest conceptual sketches all the way to post-market surveillance.
So our mission today is to deconstruct the May 29, 2026 FDA final guidance document. It's titled Content of Human Factors Information in Medical Device Marketing Submissions.
Quite a mouthful, but incredibly important.
Yeah, and to do this justice, we are pulling from a really robust stack of sources. We have the finalized 16-page FDA guidance itself, obviously, but we're also integrating comprehensive regulatory analyses from Emergo by UL, the FBA law blog.
Which had some great insights, by the way.
Oh, they were fantastic. We also have insights from the Regulatory Affairs Professional Society, or RAPS, and some critical industry intelligence on how this specifically ties into the newly enforced Quality Management System Regulation, the QMSR.
Right, which is the shadow hanging over all of this.
Exactly. So think of this 2026 guidance as a brand new set of traffic laws for your product development lifecycle. The FDA is basically offering the industry a trade-off here.
A very strict trade-off.
Right. They're introducing a streamlined, risk-based pathway that lets you use the fast lane to avoid redundant, costly human factors validation testing.
Which sounds great on paper.
It does, but the toll cameras are checking your engine's maintenance logs every single mile. Taking this fast lane requires a level of internal mechanical precision that, frankly, many organizations simply haven't achieved yet.
No, they haven't. And that internal mechanical precision is really the crux of the issue here. Because historically, human factors engineering, or HFE, has often been treated as as a localized final hour compliance checkbox.
Like an afterthought.
Exactly. An engineering team builds the device, they finalize the design, and then right before assembling the regulatory submission, they basically toss the prototype over the wall to the human factors team.
Just saying, hey, go prove this is safe.
Right. The directive is usually just to run a summative validation study, prove it's safe, and check a box for the FDA reviewer. But this new finalized guidance completely dismantles that siloed retrospective approach.
It forces human factors to be proactive.
Integrated into the entire life cycle, yes. Yeah. From day one.
Well, we need to talk about the ticking clock first because, this isn't some theoretical future state. The transition window is closing rapidly, and the operational reality is about to hit the industry hard.
Very hard.
So the FDA published this final guidance on May 29, 2026. What does the operational timeline actually look like for, say, a regulatory affairs director who's planning a submission for the third quarter of this year?
Well, the FDA has established a strict 60-day operational window from the date of publication. In practice, that means any marketing application, whether that's a traditional 510K, a de novo classification request, or a PMA that is received by the agency before August 1st, 2026, falls under a transitional review policy.
Okay, so there is a bit of a grace period.
A very brief one, yeah. For those early submissions, the FDA recognizes that companies have been operating under the older paradigms or the previous draft guidance, so they don't generally anticipate that you'll have fully integrated the new structures yet. It remains voluntary for a few more weeks.
But let me push back on the leniency of that grace period. Even if it's technically transitional, we know FDA reviewers have been, gradually adopting this risk-based philosophy for the past year or two anyway.
That's completely true. You can't rely on the grace period to save a bad submission.
Right. So let's look at the hard cutoff. If a regulatory team misses that August 1st deadline and they just submit a legacy-style localized human factors report on August 2nd, what is the actual mechanical reality of that failure?
Oh, the mechanical reality is severe. Immediate review delays.
Wow.
Yeah, if you submit under the old paradigm after August 1st, you run an incredibly high risk of immediate review holds and formal requests for additional information.
The dreaded AI requests.
Exactly. And an AI request on human factors can pause your clearance timeline for months, because you can't just slap a new cover letter on an old report structure to fix it.
Right. It's foundational.
Exactly. If the FDA determines your risk analysis doesn't map to the new categorization requirements, you might have to completely reevaluate your hazard analysis. Or worse, execute a brand new empirical study that you hadn't budgeted time or money for.
Which is a disaster for a product launch.
The financial implications of delayed market access are massive.
And the structural mechanism of submission has changed alongside the guidance, which I think makes this even more rigid, because human factors is no longer this isolated technical review topic buried in, Appendix G of a massive PDF.
No, it's front and center now.
Right. The FDA explicitly updated the eStar software, the electronic submission template and resource, to hardwire this guidance into the intake process.
Which is a massive procedural shift.
It is. So how does that practically change the workflow for someone who is physically sitting there building the submission?
Well, the eStar update fundamentally alters the intake architecture. In that interactive template, submitters must now explicitly declare their human factors submission category right up front.
Like as a mandatory field.
Yes. We will define those specific categories shortly, but the key takeaway is that the software forces your hand. Once you select a category from the drop-down menu, the eStar logic dynamically generates the required attachment fields for that specific category's documentation.
So you literally cannot proceed without it.
You must upload the corresponding files directly into the template. You can't skip it, you can't leave it blank, and you definitely can't defer it with a promise to provide it later in the review cycle.
Wow. So by integrating this directly into eStar, the FDA has basically transformed human factors from a retrospective document dump into an automated, non-negotiable gateway.
That's a great way to put it. Every single CDRH marketing submission is systematically screened for usability compliance on day one, before a human reviewer even looks at your clinical data.
That's wild. But wait, if eStar locks us into declaring a category on day one, what happens if there's a disconnect internally?
What do you mean?
Say, a clinical trial halfway through development reveals a usability issue, and that forces the R&D team to change the user interface. Are they stuck starting the eStar submission entirely from scratch because their usability story changed?
They very well might be.
Yeah.
At a minimum, they have to completely reassess their regulatory strategy. This systemic integration forces R&D, regulatory affairs, and quality teams to completely merge their silos.
They have to talk to each other.
Constantly. Because if regulatory is building an eStar submission and selects category 1, but then discovers that quality doesn't have the requisite use-related risk analysis to justify that low-burden category.
Because R&D tweaked the interface last month without telling anyone.
Exactly. Then the entire filing is paralyzed. You cannot reverse engineer your regulatory strategy at the 11th hour. The usability engineering lifecycle has to be aligned from concept discovery all the way through to that final eStar upload.
So since eStar requires us to declare a category, we really need to map out exactly how the FDA's new decision-making flowchart determines those categories. The guidance provides this highly structured flowchart with 4 critical decision points. Let's walk through the initial triage. The logic tree begins with decision point A.
Right. Decision point A is a foundational triage step. It asks us a seemingly straightforward question. Is this submission for a modification to an existing legally marketed device?
Okay, simple enough.
Yeah. If you are developing a novel device from scratch, you bypass the modification-specific queries entirely and skip straight ahead to decision point C. But if you are modifying a device, say submitting a new 510K for a line extension or a PMA supplement, you answer yes and move to decision point B.
Got it. And for those modified devices, decision point B asks, are there changes to the user interface, intended users, clinical applications, environments, training, or labeling?
It's a very broad net.
I want to pause on the breadth of that question, because if an R&D team answers no, meaning they've merely tweaked, I don't know, an internal component like a battery housing or a gas valving system that has absolutely zero bearing on how the user interacts with the system, they land in human factors submission category 1.
Correct.
So what does a category 1 submission actually look like in the dossier?
Well, Category 1 represents the lowest possible burden of evidence. If you land here, your submission only requires Section 1 of the HFE report, which consists of a conclusion and a high-level summary.
That sounds pretty painless.
It is. You essentially provide a brief, documented justification showing exactly why the internal modifications do not affect usability at all. You also reference your prior, cleared human factors evaluations for the existing device.
So it's basically an engineering rationale.
Right. You're stating, we changed the internal gas valving system, but the user never touches it, never sees it, the alarms haven't changed, and therefore the established, cleared usability profile remains completely intact.
Makes sense. But the danger lies in underestimating what constitutes a change to the user interface, right?
Right.
If we answer yes to decision point B, meaning we did change the interface, the labeling, or the user population, we proceed to decision point C.
Yes, and remember, brand new devices also funnel directly into decision point C.
Right. And this is where the use-related risk analysis, the URA, becomes the absolute center of gravity for the submission.
Completely. Decision point C is entirely URA-based. It asks, based on your risk analysis, are there critical tasks? And that question is for new devices. For modified devices, the question shifts slightly. Are there new critical tasks introduced, or are existing critical tasks impacted by the modification?
So the entire categorization hinges on the nuance of a critical task. Now, for an audience of medical safety and regulatory professionals, the basic definition of a critical task is well understood, right? It's a task that, if performed incorrectly or omitted, could cause serious harm.
That's the baseline, yes.
But the way the FDA is interpreting compromised medical care within this 2026 framework seems much broader than just, catastrophic physical injury. Are they looking at slight therapy delays as critical tasks now?
They absolutely are, and that is a vital distinction for you to understand. The agency has significantly widened the lens on what constitutes harm. It is not just about a surgical instrument lacerating an artery.
Right.
If a diagnostic device has a confusing interface that causes a user to misinterpret a false positive, leading to a delay in critical therapy, that is a critical task.
Wow.
Or if a home-use infusion pump has a complex alarm silencing sequence that causes a lay caregiver to accidentally turn off the device instead of muting it, leading to missed medication, that is a critical task. The URA must capture these nuanced, system-level harms.
Okay, so if a regulatory team looks at their URA and determines that objectively there are no critical tasks for their new device, or that their modification doesn't impact any existing critical tasks, they land in human factors submission category 2.
Correct.
What is the documentation burden for category 2?
It's a step up. Category 2 requires sections 1 through 4 of the standard HFE report outline. You must provide the conclusion and summary, detailed descriptions of the intended users and operational context, a thorough description of the device user interface, and a summary of known use problems associated with previous or similar devices. However, the primary, heavily scrutinized focus here is providing a robust, objective rationale explaining exactly why there are no critical tasks or why your modifications have zero impact on the existing ones.
So you really have to prove the negative. The analogy I keep coming back to is baking. Categories 1 and 2 are like proving to a health inspector that you haven't changed your bakery's recipe enough to cause a new food allergy.
I like that.
You're meticulously documenting your ingredients and explaining your work, but you are not required to run a massive double-blind clinical trial to prove the bread is safe. You justify safety through analysis. But what if there are critical tasks? What if you are baking an entirely new cake with novel ingredients?
Then the inspector wants proof. If you answer yes to decision point C, meaning your URA identifies critical tasks or impacted critical tasks, historically, under older paradigms, you would have been automatically routed to Category 3.
And Category 3 is the heavy lifter.
It is the heaviest regulatory burden. It requires all 8 sections of the HFE report. This includes the full URA, summaries of your formative preliminary evaluations, and most importantly and expensively, full summative human factors validation testing.
Category 3 means you have to taste test that new cake in front of a panel of judges. You have to physically place the device in the hands of representative users.
Yes.
Whether that's an interventional cardiologist in a simulated cath lab or a diabetic patient in a mock living room, and empirically prove they do not commit dangerous use errors. And, well, that brings us to the most fascinating and arguably the most strategically impactful element of this 2026 guidance. It's the game changer.
It truly is the defining feature of the new framework. Under historical FDA practice, hitting a yes on decision point C regarding critical task was essentially a one-way ticket to full empirical validation testing. It was a binary punitive system. You have a new critical task, go run a summative study.
Which, as anyone who has managed an R&D budget knows, takes months and massive resources. I mean, you have to draft protocols, get IRB approval, recruit specialized, hard-to-find user groups, rent out simulation environments, run the physical study, analyze the data, compile massive reports.
It's easily a six-figure endeavor, often more.
Easily. But the 2026 final guidance introduces a regulatory escape hatch for modified devices. It's called Decision Point D.
Yes. Decision Point D represents the FDA finally acknowledging that empirical physical testing isn't always the only scientific way to prove safety.
Thank goodness.
It asks a pivotal, deeply analytical question. Even if you have new or impacted critical tasks, should human factors validation test data actually be submitted? It formally allows manufacturers to submit a robust, objective rationale in lieu of new empirical validation data.
I mean, this is the holy grail for accelerating R&D timelines and cutting budgets. But I'm looking at the Emergo analysis, and they make it very clear the FDA isn't just handing out free passes here.
Absolutely not.
The agency has established 3 core parameters that a manufacturer must rigorously, objectively evaluate to qualify for this exception. Let's dig into the first parameter, the user interface history of use.
Right, so the history of use parameter requires a deep dive analysis of the historical, real-world performance of the interface when deployed within the intended environment by the designated user populations and for the specified clinical indications.
It's so real-world data.
Yes. The FDA is actively looking for high-integrity post-market surveillance data that clearly demonstrates exceptionally low rates of use-related adverse events, close calls, or user errors.
Wait, let me challenge the ambiguity of that requirement for a second. If I'm an R&D lead and I desperately want to use Decision Point D to skip a $150,000 summative validation study, what exactly qualifies as sufficient history of use?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right. If my predicate device has been on the market for 6 months and we haven't received a single customer complaint, why wouldn't that qualify? It feels like the FDA is moving the goalposts if they reject that.
It might feel that way to an R&D lead eager to hit a deadline, sure, but let's look at the statistics of post-market surveillance. The guidance purposely refrains from specifying a strict, arbitrary chronological cutoff.
Yeah, they don't say 36 months of data required.
Exactly, they don't give a hard number. However, the qualitative and statistical bar is exceptionally high. 6 months of data on, say, a low-volume, highly specialized surgical device is almost certainly insufficient to prove a trend. The FDA expects statistically meaningful, long-term commercial deployment data.
That makes sense. It has to be a robust data set.
And furthermore, you must prove that the history of use applies directly and unequivocally to the specific user group and the specific environment.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, if your clean history of use is based on highly trained nurses operating the device in a well-lit, sterile ICU, you cannot leverage that exact same data to justify skipping testing for a new indication where the modified device will be used by sleep-deprived lay caregivers in a dim home environment.
Ah.
The operational context must match perfectly or the data is irrelevant.
That makes perfect logical sense. It must be an apples-to-apples comparison. You can't use hospital data to prove home use safety. Okay, so the second core parameter of Decision Point D is user interface complexity.
Complexity is a major hurdle. The FDA explicitly defines a complex user interface as one involving active management tasks.
What does that entail?
This encompasses systems requiring advanced programming, continuous system-wide monitoring, or intricate multi-step maintenance protocols. It also includes hardware systems characterized by sequential multi-step operations.
Like physical assembly.
Right, such as specific physical connections, disconnections, or parameter selections that directly influence clinical operations and patient outcomes.
To put that in practical terms for you, a single-use, Auto-retracting safety scalpel, where you just press a button. That's low complexity. A closed-loop automated insulin delivery system where the user has to input precise carbohydrate ratios, adjust basal rates, and respond to predictive low-glucose alarms. High complexity.
Exactly. And the regulatory reality is that the more complex the interface, the harder it becomes to justify skipping validation testing under Decision Point D.
Naturally.
If you have a complex UI, you need an overwhelmingly massive history of clean use and absolutely rock-solid risk controls to pass this gate. Which brings us to the third parameter, the adequacy of existing risk control measures.
Right, so the third parameter asks, can you objectively prove that your existing hardware interlocks, software restrictions, or physical design mitigations already prevent the specific use error associated with the newly impacted critical task?
This is where pure engineering rationales take center stage. You must provide documented proof, often utilizing highly specific usability verification data or physical bench testing, showing that the mitigation is effective without needing a human to prove it.
Could you give an example of that?
Sure. Consider a scenario where your modification impacts the critical task of connecting a pressurized fluid line. If your existing design utilizes a proprietary, physically keyed connector, like a poka-yoke design, that makes it mechanically and geometrically impossible to connect the line backward, that existing risk control is deemed adequate.
Because they physically can't do it wrong.
Precisely. You don't necessarily need to run a 15-person human factors trial just to watch people repeatedly fail to force a square peg into a round hole. You can prove a physical impossibility through engineering data.
Okay, so Decision Point D is an incredible tool. It allows an organization to down-categorize a submission from a burdensome Category 3 to a streamlined Category 2 for modified devices, provided their history of use is pristine, their complexity is manageable, and their engineering risk controls are bulletproof. It sounds like the FDA is being incredibly reasonable and efficient here.
They are offering unprecedented efficiency, yes, but consider the alternative perspective. While the pre-market review might be streamlined, we have to look at the holistic regulatory burden.
Because there's always a catch.
There is always a catch. This guidance doesn't just help you, it drastically increases the scrutiny on your internal operations. There is a massive structural catch to utilizing Decision Point D.
The dreaded footnote 28. If a regulatory writer is rushing through the guidance document, they might miss it entirely, but the legal analysts at the FDA law blog certainly didn't. What is the reality of footnote 28, and why is it currently keeping quality assurance directors awake at night?
Footnote 28 is the linchpin that connects this guidance to the broader regulatory ecosystem. It explicitly links the human factors documentation requirements directly to the Quality Management System Regulation, the QMSR.
Which was fully implemented and enforced starting on February 2, 2026.
Exactly. This footnote essentially serves as a legal warning. It states that while a successful, well-argued justification under Decision Point D may exempt you from submitting raw validation test data to the CDRH reviewers during a pre-market clearance review, you are absolutely not exempt from the underlying design verification and validation requirements mandated under the QMSR.
I want to make sure everyone listening absorbs this fully, because it is the definition of an audit trap. Bringing back our traffic laws metaphor. It's like the IRS telling you that you no longer have to attach every single business receipt to your annual tax return to get your refund. You get the fast lane.
Right.
But you had better have every single one of those receipts meticulously organized in a shoebox, because when you get audited, they are going to tear through them. Using Decision Point D means you don't have to put the validation data in your 510K submission folder. It absolutely does not mean you are excused from doing the work.
That is a terrifying but entirely accurate analogy for regulatory professionals. The FDA is systematically aligning its pre-market expectations with its post-market quality system inspections. The agency is demanding data-driven, life-cycle-based regulatory oversight.
So they will check your math eventually.
Oh, they will. You must maintain complete, exhaustive human factors engineering files, the full iterative use-related risk analysis, and all supporting usability records within your internal design history file, the DHF.
And FDA investigators are going to pull those during routine audits.
Yes. The investigators who show up at your manufacturing facility for routine post-market audits will pull these exact files. If an investigator reviews your DHF and discovers that your Decision Point D justification was little more than a qualitative theoretical guess made by marketing, without rigorous hazard analysis and objective engineering data backing it up, you are looking at serious nonconformance findings.
Which means a 483 observation.
Or potentially a warning letter which can halt manufacturing entirely.
So this demand for a logical, life cycle-based approach isn't just hidden in footnotes. It's reflected in a very subtle but critical structural change in the final guidance document itself. The FDA took the old HFE report outline from the 2016 draft guidance and completely reorganized it. Specifically, they flipped the order of sections 5 and 6.
Yes, and that flip changes the entire narrative flow of the submission. Under the new 2026 paradigm, Section 5 is now the summary of preliminary evaluations.
Which includes what, exactly?
This is where you detail your formative mock-up testing, your early heuristic analyses, and early user walkthroughs. Section 6 is now the analysis of hazards and risks, which contains your URA. In the older guidance, the risk analysis was presented before the preliminary testing.
See, I'd argue it's even more restrictive than just a formatting change. By flipping those sections, the FDA is forcing companies to tell a chronological cause and effect engineering story.
Precisely.
In the past, companies would often build the device, draft a theoretical risk analysis in a vacuum, and then treat formative testing as a lightweight afterthought just to see if users liked the color scheme. Now, you cannot reverse engineer your hazard analysis. By putting formative evaluations first, you have to definitively prove that your early mock-up tests actually informed and shaped your risk profile.
It is a brilliant regulatory maneuver by the agency. It single-handedly shifts human factors from a retrospective check-the-box exercise to a proactive, life-cycle-driven engineering rationale.
You have to show your work.
Yes. A manufacturer must now demonstrate exactly how early-stage testing directly uncovered hazards, how those specific hazards were translated into the URA in Section 6, and how that risk analysis ultimately dictated the identification of critical tasks in Section 7. Regulatory reviewers at the CDRH can now easily trace your engineering logic from initial concept discovery directly through to the final validation protocols.
It prevents companies from hiding user errors, frankly. If your Section 5 formative testing shows that 5 out of 10 nurses consistently misunderstood a blinking warning light, that specific cognitive hazard had better show up explicitly in your Section 6 URA.
Absolutely.
And more importantly, it better have a documented mitigation strategy applied to it before you get to the final validation testing.
Exactly. If there are narrative gaps, if a severe hazard identified during a preliminary formative evaluation magically disappears from the URA without a documented engineering or labeling mitigation, the FDA reviewer will catch it immediately.
Because it's right there in sequential order.
Right. The narrative flow of the new report structure demands continuity. You can't just drop a thread because it's inconvenient to fix.
Well, we have spent a lot of time analyzing the theoretical framework, the decision flow charts, and the report structures. But to truly understand how Decision Point D and the URA categorization play out in the messy reality of product development, we really need to look at the expanded practical examples the FDA explicitly provided in the 2026 appendices.
They are so helpful.
They actually tripled the page count of these case studies compared to the old draft guidance. The FDA recognized that the industry needed concrete examples of how to apply these highly nuanced concepts.
The appendices are invaluable because they provide scenarios covering everything from simple, low-risk modifications to incredibly complex, software-driven, high-risk systems. They really show the FDA's math.
Let's start with Case 1, which is found in Appendix Example A.5. This involves a highly relevant real-world scenario, a reusable duodenoscope.
A classic complex device.
The scenario is that the manufacturer currently has a legally marketed, cleared 510K for the device. However, a post-market investigation into reports of severe patient infections reveals that the root cause is inadequate reprocessing by hospital staff due to insufficient cleaning of the internal channels.
Which has been a well-documented industry issue.
Right. So in response to this safety signal, the manufacturer is changing the reprocessing instructions. They are adding additional highly specific channel brushing steps to the IFU, and they are submitting a new 510K for the modification.
Okay, let's run this scenario strictly through the new flowchart logic. Decision point A. Is it a modification to an existing device? Yes. Decision point B. Are there changes to the labeling, training, or user interface?
Yes, the instructions for use are changing.
Exactly, to include new multi-step reprocessing instructions. Decision point C. Are existing critical tasks impacted? Yes. Reprocessing a duodenoscope is absolutely a critical task because failure leads directly to cross-contamination, superbug transmission, and severe patient harm.
And the new brushing steps fundamentally alter how that critical task is performed.
So the manufacturer arrives at the crucial decision point D. They want to avoid another expensive validation study. Does their history of use, The complexity of the interface and their existing risk controls allow them to justify a Category 2 submission and skip empirical testing.
I'm guessing no.
The FDA's answer is a definitive no. They failed Decision Point D and must submit a full Category 3 report with summative validation testing.
And what's the agency's rationale there?
The agency explicitly explains the rationale. First, duodenoscope reprocessing is universally understood to be a highly complicated, error-prone process. The interface in this context, the microscopic physical channels, the specific bristle brushes, the exact sequence of flushing and brushing operations is highly complex and involves active management.
So it fails at the complexity parameter immediately.
Yes. Second, and this is the nail in the coffin, the history of use is fraught with known use errors leading to severe patient harm.
I mean, the manufacturer simply cannot claim a clean history of use when the very reason they are submitting the modification in the first place is because of adverse infection events occurring in the real world.
Exactly. The clinical safety signal mandates that they prove empirically that the new brushing instructions actually mitigate the risk of use error. A theoretical engineering rationale arguing that if they follow the new instructions perfectly, the device will be clean, is wholly insufficient when historical post-market data proves that hospital staff inherently struggle with the task.
So they have to run a validation study to actually observe real sterile processing technicians attempting to follow the new IFU.
They have no other choice.
That makes perfect sense. The data dictates the burden. Now let's pivot to a totally different technological profile. Case 2 from example 8.6. We have a stereotaxic navigation system used for orthopedic surgery.
Okay, high-tech software.
Very. The existing cleared system uses standard 2D flat screen monitors and a traditional keyboard and mouse interface. The manufacturer wants to modernize the system by adding an augmented reality, or AR, interface that displays 3D visual guidance for instrument positioning directly over the patient.
A huge leap in technology.
But they aren't changing the fundamental surgical instruments, the cutting blocks, or the clinical indication. They are just adding this new AR visual overlay, which is controlled by voice commands and eye tracking.
Again, we walk the flowchart.
Yeah.
It's a modification to an existing system, so yes to point A. The user interface is changing drastically from a flat screen to an immersive headset, so yes to point B.
And what about point C?
Existing critical tasks, specifically the surgeon positioning the surgical instruments based on the navigation data, are impacted because the surgeon is now relying on the AR headset to perform those tasks rather than looking away at a 2D monitor. So yes to point C.
So we hit decision point D again. The underlying math of the navigation system hasn't changed. Can they justify skipping validation?
Again, the FDA says no. They fail Decision Point D and require a Category 3 submission. The FDA focuses heavily on two parameters here: complexity and history of use. The AR interface, utilizing spatial computing, voice recognition, hand gestures, and eye tracking, introduces entirely novel complexity compared to a traditional keyboard and monitor.
It's a completely different way of interacting with data.
Exactly. Furthermore, the intended user group, orthopedic surgeons, does not have a deeply established historical familiarity with this novel AR interface in this specific high-stress surgical context. You cannot leverage the safe history of use of a traditional 2D monitor to justify the safety of an immersive 3D augmented reality environment. The cognitive load, the potential for digital distraction, and the perceptual challenges are entirely different.
It's the difference between looking at a static paper map and wearing a VR headset while driving a car at 70 miles an hour. The fundamental task of navigating to a destination is the same, but the perceptual interface completely rewrites the risk profile.
That's exactly it. The FDA is strongly signaling to the industry that novel, bleeding-edge interfaces, AR, VR, highly advanced voice controls, AI-driven adaptive interfaces will almost universally trigger Category 3 validation requirements.
Because there's no history of use.
Until these interfaces become ubiquitous and deeply understood within the specific clinical population, you cannot bypass empirical testing. The agency needs to see how human brains interact with the technology under stress.
Wow. Let's move to case 3, which I find to be the most illustrative of how deeply a manufacturer has to understand their specific user population. This is example B1 involving a continuous glucose monitor, or CGM.
This one is fascinating.
The scenario is that the manufacturer has an approved, highly successful device for managing type 1 diabetes. They want to expand the clinical indications to include users with type 2 diabetes. Crucially, the physical device hardware, the sensors, the applicator, the mobile app, everything remains mathematically and physically identical. All they are doing is changing the intended user population on the label.
This specific case study is where the nuance of human factors engineering really shines. shines. It is a modification, yes to A. The intended user group is changing, yes to B, because the new user group is now performing the critical tasks of physically applying the sensor and reading the glucose values to dose insulin. Those existing critical tasks are impacted, yes to C.
So we're at decision point D. The device is physically identical. It has a massive, highly successful history of use in the type 1 diabetic population. The complexity hasn't changed at all. Can they skip validation?
No, they fail decision point D and must submit a Category 3 report.
Why?
And the reason why highlights the absolute depth of clinical understanding the FDA demands. You have to break down the demographic and physiological shift between the populations. The type 2 diabetes population is fundamentally physiologically different from the type 1 population. Type 2 patients are generally older. They've often progressed through years of different oral medication interventions before reaching a point where they need a CGM and insulin therapy.
And physically, the disease manifests differently over time, right? The physical capabilities of the user chain.
Yes. People with type 2 diabetes often have additional severe comorbidities due to disease progression later in life. They frequently suffer from disease-related impairments like peripheral neuropathy, which severely affects their tactile sensation, grip strength, and physical ability to interact with small device components like an applicator button.
Right.
They also frequently suffer from diabetic retinopathy, which degrades their visual perception and ability to read the contrast on a mobile app interface.
So even though the device is exactly the same and it works flawlessly for a 25-year-old with type 1 diabetes who has been managing their condition for a decade, you cannot assume that the existing risk controls the font size on the app, the required pinch grip strength to apply the sensor, will protect a 75-year-old with type 2 diabetes who has neuropathy in their fingers and failing vision.
That is the core takeaway the FDA is driving home. The agency explicitly states that considering the physiological characteristics of the new type 2 population, it is not apparent whether the existing physical and cognitive risk controls are still valid. You cannot rely on the crash history of a high-performance vehicle driven by professionals to prove it's safe for a completely different demographic.
Bringing back my sports car analogy,
Yeah.
it is exactly like building a high-performance sports car. It might be perfectly safe with a pristine safety record in the hands of a professional stunt driver. Our type 1 users who have been meticulously managing insulin and devices their entire lives, often since childhood.
Right.
But if you take that exact same car with the exact same brakes and engine and hand the keys to a completely different demographic, perhaps a novice driver or someone with slower reflexes, you can't just wave the previous safety data at the regulator and say, look, the car is safe. The context of the user changes the fundamental safety equation.
And that illustrates why the use-related risk analysis must be a living, breathing document that deeply contemplates the human element, not just the electromechanical reliability of the device. The URA must account for the physical, cognitive, and emotional state of the specific user.
This has been an incredibly dense, exhaustive, but necessary journey through the 2026 framework. Let's start bringing this home and summarizing the massive operational shifts we've uncovered today. The FDA has fundamentally shifted toward a risk-based justification model. They have provided a remarkable tool in Decision Point D, allowing manufacturers to leverage history of use, analyze complexity, and rely on existing engineering risk controls to justify avoiding empirical validation testing for impacted critical tasks.
But as we discussed at length, that flexibility is a double-edged sword. The shadow of QMSR enforcement looms large over every decision.
It really does.
The FDA is trusting you to do the rigorous analytical work internally, and they will verify it during post-market facility audits. The traditional silos between regulatory affairs, who write the eSTAR submissions, and quality assurance, who maintain the design history files, must be demolished. They have to operate from the exact same risk data.
And it means post-market surveillance data is no longer just a reactionary, defensive tool to manage customer complaints and keep the FDA off your back. Clean, high-integrity post-market data must now directly feed into your pre-market regulatory strategy.
Yes, a proactive tool.
If you want to leverage Decision Point D for your next product iteration, your complaint handling and surveillance data needs to be flawless, providing that objective, statistically significant history of use evidence.
It creates a true, closed-loop total product lifecycle. Post-market data justifies pre-market efficiency. If your post-market data is messy, your pre-market pathways become incredibly expensive and slow.
I want to leave you, our listeners, with one final provocative thought to mull over. And it ties back to the high-stakes scenario I mentioned at the very beginning of the show. It goes back to the very definition of the user interface. According to the FDA and harmonized international standards like IEC 623661, the user interface isn't just the physical buttons, the dials, or the software screens on an iPad. The instructions for use, the training materials, the quick reference guides, and the warning labels printed on the side of the box are the user interface.
That is a critical regulatory definition that consistently trips up many commercial organizations, especially marketing departments.
So consider this highly realistic scenario. Your marketing department decides they want to do a mid-cycle brand refresh. They want to reorganize the training manual to make it look sleeker. Or maybe they decide to change the font size on a critical warning label to accommodate a new, larger corporate logo. To the marketing team, it's a simple, harmless graphic design update. But under this 2026 guidance, that is technically a user interface modification. You are forced to hit yes on decision point B in the flowchart.
And if that specific warning label relates to a critical task like warning a user not to reuse a single-use component, you are forced to hit yes on decision point C.
So the terrifying question for regulatory professionals is, could a simple graphic design update to a label theoretically trigger an impacted critical task, fail decision point D because you have absolutely no history of use for the new layout, and suddenly force your company into a multi-month, massively expensive, summative validation study?
Theoretically and practically, yes. If the graphic design change, the font size, the color contrast, the placement of the text, impacts how a user comprehends a critical warning, it absolutely could force a validation study.
Wow.
If you make the font smaller and your user population includes elderly patients with poor vision, you have introduced a new cognitive hazard.
The boundary of what constitutes engineering has officially blurred into labeling, training, and even graphic design. Every single touch point a user has with your product, from the physical button to the font on the box, is a regulatory vector. So the next time someone asks to tweak a label, remember that the toll cameras are watching, and you'd better make sure your maintenance logs are up to date.
A sobering but essential reality for the modern medical device landscape. The organizations that master this proactive integration will thrive, and those that treat it as a checkbox will face endless review cycles.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Stay compliant, stay curious, and we'll see you next time.